Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Catherine Brobeck.
And I'm Kemper Donovan.
And this week, we have the pleasure to bring to you Lord Edgware Dies.
A.K.A. 13 at Dinner.
A.K.A. 13 at Dinner. So how did that come to pass, you say? Well, it was first published by, of course, Collins Crime Club in September of 1933. But in the U.S., it was called 13 at Dinner. And it was actually published under that in the U.S. for quite some time. And prior to that, serialized under the same title in the American magazines. I hate to say this up front, but the problem with the title change is that while Lord Edgware Dies is, I suppose, a spoiler, 13 at Dinner is a much bigger spoiler.
In that it focuses a reader on the issue of that dinner party.
Correct.
That's your
yes.
problem with that? Yeah, it's potentially problematic. I still think it's okay. I kind of like 13 at Dinner. It's I like when the titles have a little bit of spooky spice to them. Spooky Spice is like the Lost Spice Girl.
She would have been like Veruca Salt. Is that what her name was? From
Veruca
No,
Veruca
not Veruca
Salt.
Salt.
I want the world. I want the whole world.
From The Craft.
Light as a feather, stiff as a board. Light as a feather, stiff as a board. Light as a feather, stiff as a board.
Veruca Balk, who, by the way, starred first, way before The Craft, as, wait for it, Dorothy Gale in the sequel to The Wizard of Oz, Return to Oz in 1985, which is actually a terrifying movie.
Come here, chicken!
All right, let's move on to our victim, who is, yes, we already spoiled it, as did Christie herself in her title, Lord Edgware. So Lord Edgware is a gentleman with two ex-wives. One of them is dead before the story starts, and that was probably a good thing for her, because Lord Edgware is not a very nice guy. The other Lady Edgware is very much alive at the start of the story, and that is Jane Wilkinson. And we will get to her in a moment. But Lord Edgware, he's off by something very sharp to the back of the skull.
Right.
And that stab wound is very artfully done because it's just at the base of the skull in the medulla oblongata. So it's like a straight knife shiv done with almost professional skill and precision that would have killed him instantly. When it went in. We do have other victims. We will get to them. We, in fact, have a second and a third victim.
But it will ruin a little bit of the suspense if we give that up front.
Exactly. So let's talk about our suspects.
So we have first off Jane Wilkinson, who is a famous film actress who has talked very publicly about wanting to kill her husband because, you know what, he wouldn't give her a divorce. And she really, really wants to marry a monk-like gentleman. And a gentleman he is because he's also a lord, but he's a little bit of an upgrade lord.
Yeah, exactly.
A newer model.
Next, we have Carlotta Adams, who is another actress. Are we noticing a pattern here with lots of actors in this novel? That may or may not be significant in a Christie story. Carlotta Adams is a stage actress as opposed to a film actress, and one who does a lot of impersonations. And at the start of the story, she very publicly impersonates Jane Wilkinson. She is quite young and quite good at what she does and seems to have a very big and successful career ahead of her.
And then we have, wait for it, another film actor, Brian Martin. He is very handsome.
Yeah, it's like his main characteristic is that he's super handsome.
Yeah, he doesn't really seem to have a personality. It's just that he is real handsome.
Speaking of handsome men, we have Alton, the butler. That is Lord Edgware's butler, and he is very, very handsome. Like, if Brian Martin is a 10 out of 10, Alton is a 15 out of 10. Maybe 1,000 out of 10. Hastings notes it multiple times. Japp even notes it multiple times.
Do you know what I thought he might be? Rocky in Rocky Horror Picture Show?
Oh, yeah.
Touch me! I want to be dirty! Really, fulfill me! Creature of the night!
The, like, Adonis with the gold lame
The gold lame
trunks?
loincloth. I guess they're trunks, yeah. Yeah,
that's sort of what I was picturing him as, you know, some sort of, like, a chiseled, made-up man.
Yeah, and I think that's apt because the other characteristic we get about him is that he is somewhat effeminate, which is not okay in Captain Hastings' book. But yeah, we will very much get there. Let's move on for now.
Indeed. We have Captain Ronald/Ronnie Marsh. He is the heir to the Edgware title. He comes off as rather suspicious, deeply in the hawk. He needs the money. So he has actually been pursuing Lord Edgware kind of desperately and pathetically for some extra cash.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, he is, of course, also the heir to the title. So should Lord Edgware die, he would inherit.
He would, in fact, be Lord Edgware.
He would be the new Lord Edgware. We then have Miss Geraldine Marsh, who is Lord Edgware's pale, sallow, and sad daughter. She lives at Regent Gate with her father and is friendly with Captain Marsh, who I suppose is her cousin.
Right. And we have Miss Carroll, who is Edgware's secretary. She's a huge busybody. She just is spying and suspicious of everyone who comes into the house. She seems really like bad news. I don't know that there's anything that sinister about her, but her constant presence is ominous.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the world as it appears to be, how we meet up with all these characters to the point where our titular character dies. We open at the theater. Not surprising, given all these actors. Poirot goes to the theater, but afterwards, Lady Edgware, a.k.a. Jane Wilkinson, approaches him at dinner and asks him to her suite at the Savoy. He agrees and he goes. And Captain Hastings, by the way, is once again narrating this from the first person, so Hastings is accompanying him. So they go to the Savoy, and Lady Edgware says that she is looking to get rid of her husband since he won't agree to a divorce. Poirot says that he is not in the business of divorce. He solves murders and more important crimes than this. He's not the go-between for marital spats. But Lady Edgware disagrees, and she's not the kind of person who is used to hearing the word no. And she gives Poirot champagne and bats those eyelashes and plies him with her husky voice. I think it's mentioned approximately 9,000 times in the course of this novel that she has a husky, seductive voice. So it works, and Poirot agrees to go talk to Lord Edgware.
So much to Poirot's great shock, and Poirot, thinks he knows everything. Lord Edgware tells him that, well, why is he even here? This is ridiculous because he already agreed to the divorce and months beforehand because Jane is not the kind of woman that you keep around.
Right. And then they return to Lady Edgware, and she's totally shocked. She says, oops, I guess I missed that letter. I guess I for some reason never got the letter that he sent saying that he was totally cool with divorce. And maybe he doesn't even mean it anyway, but okay, totally cool. I guess I can go marry my Anglican monk Lord Merton now. Woohoo!
Right, and so Poirot's like, well, I didn't do anything. And she's like, oh, no, but you have my ever-loving thanks. Excellent results for me. And then Lord Edgware dies. And on the night he died, Elton, the sexy butler, opened the door to a lady who looked to him just like Jane Wilkinson, although they hadn't met because Jane had not been showing up at home. And she asked to see her husband, quote unquote. So Elton shows her in. Miss Carroll is snooping, and she spies this woman from one floor up. She swears it's Jane, except as we find out, what she sees is a woman wearing a hat.
Right, she never actually sees her face because of her angle from this gallery above when this person was walking through the foyer. But what they presume happened, both Alton and Miss Carroll, is that Jane Wilkinson then walked into Lord Edgware's study and killed him and then walked out. So that seems rather open and shut. Everyone assumes that Jane did it, but Poirot is not convinced because, of course, he has this knowledge from his previous dealings with Jane Wilkinson that her supposed motive, the reason why she joked to an entire party's worth of people that she wanted to kill Lord Edgware, has been neutralized in that Lord Edgware is totally consenting to a divorce. So Poirot tells Japp as much. Our lovely Jimmy Japp is on the case. And very much a part of this story.
And Japp is really annoyed.
Yeah, he's very annoyed because he wanted this case to be nice and simple and clean. And at that point, Poirot investigates, and now I think it is time for us to figure out the world as it actually is.
It's interesting because on one hand, it's so ridiculously straightforward that we almost don't have to talk about it, but then we wouldn't have a book. So So we're going to go through some clues, but I want to point out that one of my problems with this is what I just said.
A dearth of actual clues that need to be solved to get to the mystery of who did it.
Correct.
Yeah, I think it's a fair critique of this book because in addition to there not being very many traditional clues, and, you know, we love our traditional clues, there are a lot of red herrings and complications that have nothing to do with figuring out this puzzle. A lot of the chatter that's going on, and this is chatter coming from Poirot, too, which is very unusual. I mean, usually when Poirot is speaking, he's saying something worthwhile. He says a lot of nonsense here, and there's all sorts of even physical pieces of evidence. We've got these glasses, we have a box of poison, we have an inscription on that box of poison, all these things that end up having really nothing to do with anything. And that's frustrating. All of those things that I just mentioned, they can all be explained away after the fact. And they were all in the course of the committing of the 3 murders that take place in the story. But they can't actually be used to solve the murders. Right.
I guess we can go through the clues while saying still that you don't actually even need the clues to solve the case.
You do, though. You do need these
the clues to figure out what happened, which is a different thing. Okay, let me make this distinction. This is a book in which you need all of the clues to figure out what happened. You do not need the clues to figure out who done it.
I disagree, actually, because I think that the very first clue, I think, belies that hypothesis. Because I think if you were really smart and you figured out clue number 1, which you could figure out by like page 10, you would know.
Right.
You would know.
Sure.
And I was actually annoyed with myself that I didn't know. So let's just say, so clue number 1 is that Lord Merton is Catholic.
Right.
And the deduction there is that Catholics don't like divorce.
Right.
So this whole supposed motive of Jane Wilkinson,
and
where,
he's not
he's
not a run-of-the-mill Catholic. He's an incredibly conservative one.
He's a conservative one, and he's a member of the Catholic aristocracy in England, which were sort of held up since they were in the minority, having to be totally upstanding Catholics and abide by the absolute letter of their religion. So for him, he's not going to be able to marry a divorcee. It's not enough that Lord Edgware wants to grant her a divorce. Lord Edgware has to die.
Right.
Because she can only be a widow to marry Lord Merton.
Right.
And that's a fantastic clue.
Yeah.
But I hear the frustration because it's one piece swirling amidst a sea of...
So you didn't want me to just spoil it, but dun dun dun, the murderer here is Lady Edgware. Yeah. Obviously, Japp knows this, and it's Poirot who puts all of this into motion. It's Poirot who doesn't just allow the arrest.
But Japp doesn't, again, I'd push back on that too. Japp doesn't know it. Japp just wants an easy answer. He has no idea what he's doing. Poirot is the one that actually has to find his way to figuring out what happened. Let's just go to the second clue. I mean, the second clue is one that we almost have now at this point on every podcast episode, which is that actors everywhere. Once they're actors, you need to be very, very suspicious of anything that actors are doing.
Right.
And here we have 3 actors, and we've just got to be on our guard, especially because Carlotta Adams actually has the ability, and we're given this information on practically page 1, to impersonate one of the other actors, Jane Wilkinson. So the thing that complicates this story almost immediately after we get the information that the butler and the secretary essentially saw Jane Wilkinson kill her husband.
Is that it could be either of them.
Well, we get this information that no, Jane Wilkinson was actually at a dinner party for 13 people, the 13 at dinner, which was miles and miles away, and there's no way that she could have just popped out and killed her husband. So being astute readers and seeing, there's double sightings of 2 Jane Wilkinsons here, and we know that one of these actors can impersonate the other, so I don't even think you have to be an astute reader to know that, well, one of them is the real Jane Wilkinson and one of them was Carlotta Adams. Which is it? And that answer gets further complicated by the fact that very quickly Carlotta Adams actually shows up dead.
Right. Victim number 2.
She's victim number 2. She died of an overdose of Veronal, which is found in this box by her bedside. Her maid said, I've never seen that box before. She was not a drug user. I don't know where that came from. Japp just wants to immediately say, oh, great, so she's the one who did it, and she killed herself afterward because she felt bad, or whatever. We'll figure out exactly what her motive was. Poirot's like, no, that doesn't really make sense. And I think that's the point at which a super astute reader, having read previous Christies having to do with actors, might also pick up on the fact that, and this is clue number 3, The lighting at that dinner party was not very good. It is noted that it was candles, which is certainly unusual for a story set in 1933. And also no one at that dinner party, even though there were 12 other people there, had ever actually met Jane Wilkinson before. So while it would seem really difficult for Carlotta Adams to impersonate at a dinner party this woman, she was really good at her job. And it actually could have been possible. And there's this assumption throughout most of the story that the impersonation had to have been Carlotta Adams going to see Lord Edgware. But no, the answer is that Carlotta Adams was actually at the dinner party. And that, again, leads us to the inevitable conclusion that Jane Wilkinson killed her husband.
Absolutely. Then I guess we get to clue number 4, which is why kill Carlotta Adams? You know, other than the fact that obviously she would put 2 and 2 together and realize that Jane Wilkinson killed her husband. The other thing is that she has written a letter to her little sister on the day of the murder, and it features an irregular margin. And guess what? It's reprinted in the book.
Ding, ding, ding!
Yep. And it's torn across a word. And the word is he. But guess what letter could go before the word he?
Could that be an S?
It could be an S. The letter is actually talking about how Carlotta took a job. She's getting a massive amount of money, 10,000 pounds.
Like, she's talking about the impersonation job that she's being put up for to impersonate Jane Wilkinson.
In detail to her sister. Yeah. And she wants her sister to come over to be with her. That's a massive amount of money.
Yeah.
So the irregular margin is a tip-off. The huge amount of money is another tip-off.
Well, and we should mention that the way that the letter reads, it seems as if she's saying that Ronnie Marsh is the person that's actually putting her up for this,
right, but
for this
he's
job.
Broke.
But an astute reader will remember that he's broke, so how could he have possibly paid her that 10,000 pounds for the job? And then also putting 2 and 2 together with the irregular margin and just being focused on Jane Wilkinson, one might get to the deduction that it is in fact Jane Wilkinson who put her up for the job. That's the she who she was referring to in the original version of the letter. So all of those clues line up to tell us that Jane Wilkinson did it, that she hired Carlotta Adams to appear as her at the dinner party. At the same time she went to Regent Gate, she shivved her husband with her maid's corn knife.
Yes.
Which I love that little detail, that it's a knife for one's corns on one's feet with which Lord Edgware is killed. That's not super dignified. Yeah, so Jane presumably found Carlotta's letter to her sister in Carlotta's bag, and of course Carlotta wasn't supposed to tell anyone, but she wrote that letter to her sister. She took the page out, ripped off the S in the margin to frame Ronnie Marsh, kind of showing off her intelligence at the same moment.
She's very proud of this later, just to be...
she's very proud of her ingenuity
really clear.
There. There's another moment at a luncheon late in the story at which she shows an ignorance, shall we say, for classical subjects, and someone who had attended that dinner party for 13 and conversed with Carlotta Adams impersonating Jane Wilkinson realizes, wait, this can't be the same person, because Carlotta Adams actually was an intelligent and cultured young lady. So Jane Wilkinson realizes that this has happened, and she also stabs this poor young man, and that is our
totally random writer.
Yeah, totally random writer. We're not even going to say his name because it's not even. Who cares?
His name is Donald Ross. Let's give the dead their due. I mean, for the poor guy.
That's our third murder, and then we've already made a big hullabaloo about how there are all these red herring clues and pieces of physical evidence, and I could only identify one of the Christie patented side plots, which at least account for some of the confusion and make for like a nice tidy wrap up. That side plot is not terribly interesting. It just involves Geraldine and Ronnie Marsh. They, the night that Lord Edgware was murdered, actually rushed back to his house, which is Geraldine's house, because Geraldine wanted to retrieve some pearls and give them to Ronnie, who, as we mentioned, was in debt and desperately needed the money. That really made them both look very suspicious, and there is a lot of ink spilled in the book about whether or not they were, in fact, in cahoots and had murdered Lord Edgware. There's even a little bit of confusion as to, we mentioned there was this inscription on the box of Veronal that was used to kill Carlotta Adams. The person who gave it says that they're D. We just get the letter D. So for a lot of the book, there's also, who's D? Who could this D possibly be?
Right.
And Ronnie Marsh refers to Geraldine as Dina. a handful of times, and having just read Peril at End House, I thought I was so clever. I was like, circle Dina, and I was like, oh, that's D, but it's a red herring clue.
But not only that, but Carlotta Adams' BFF is a milliner or lady designer whose name is Jenny Driver.
Yeah, and Poirot even mentions the fact, well, her last name does begin with D, but I thought it was clever that the exact clue of a nickname being significant was repeated in the next novel and not at all important. Props, Dame Agatha.
Right. I mean, there's one other clue which also ultimately isn't important. It's not a side plot clue, but there's the phone call, and so that's one of Poirot's 5 questions. We've addressed really the other 5 without naming them, but there's a mystery phone call during the dinner. And that is an ongoing question. Who possibly would call Jane Wilkinson at this dinner party and hang up?
And, of course, it ends up being Jane Wilkinson. For the very good reason that if the impersonation act didn't actually work at the dinner party, then Carlotta Adams would have indicated such by her response.
Correct.
But it did work, and she...
And so it's unnecessary. So it's not even also exactly a clue, because it kind of
just
ultimately...
Just a complication.
Yeah, just a complication.
Christie mentioned her inspiration for it was the actress Ruth Draper, who is a very famous impersonation artist, and she saw her one day, and she was really impressed by the way that she could transform from a nagging wife to a peasant girl kneeling in a cathedral, and she just was thinking about Ruth Draper, and that is what led to Lord Edgware Dies. So from the beginning, this book is very much about impersonating and costuming and masking oneself and being deceptive, which, as we've discussed, is very much central to so many of these Christie stories. I did also think it was interesting, and this is directly referenced in the novel, the Elizabeth Canning case, which is actually, it's this fascinating 18th century kidnapping case where there was this maidservant who claimed that she had been kidnapped and held prisoner in a certain house for a month. Yet at the same time, other people said that they had seen this woman in another place, and it turned out that she was totally lying. It was a total hoax, and that case is actually the basis for one of my favorite Golden Age detective novels, which is why I just wanted to highlight it, which is called The Franchise Affair by Josephine Tey. So I was tickled that the Elizabeth Canning case was directly referenced in this novel.
So everyone go out and buy that.
The thing that I will say in favor of this book, and it's the one thing that I felt was never captured in either of the adaptations that we watched. There are actually 3 film adaptations of this novel, and we were only able to watch 2 of them, but we'll get to that in a moment. And it's just that, for me, the most sympathetic and in some ways interesting character was actually Carlotta Adams.
Yeah.
Because
I agree with that.
She's this young, gifted, rather innocent, but also very much reserved person who is drawn, I thought, extremely effectively. When she's introduced both through Hastings watching her on stage and then when they go to this dinner party afterward, I just felt like, oh, I know exactly who she is. I thought she was very skillfully drawn, and I liked her and I respected her immediately. And
well, it's also, I will say, to give the book a lot of credit, it opens very strong. Mm-hmm. And part of that is the description of her on stage and the fact that Hastings is like a little bit enamored with her performance. So we're seeing that view of it, I think.
Yeah, and it's not surprising that that was taken directly from life, right? I mean, I'm sure that's how Agatha Christie felt watching Ruth Draper.
Right.
And then given that rather successful characterization of Carlotta Adams, it's actually really affecting when Carlotta Adams is found dead. And
yeah.
So this is what I thought the best part of the novel was, and I just wanted to pull some of the prose here. This is when Poirot and Hastings rush to Carlotta Adams's flat because Poirot realizes suddenly, oh, she may be in danger, and he's too late. And we have her maid speaking. "Would you like to look at her, sir?" asked the maid tearfully. "Looks beautiful, she does." We followed her into the bedroom. Carlotta Adams looked strangely peaceful and much younger than she had appeared that night at the Savoy. She looked like a tired child asleep. There was a strange expression on Poirot's face as he stood looking down on her. I saw him making the sign of the cross. "J'ai fait un serment, Hastings," he said as we went down the stairs. I did not ask him what his vow was. I could guess. Poirot is very affected by Carlotta Adams' death, and that is truly what motivates him. Later on, he says, "I do not like to see youth deprived of its right to live. I feel very strongly about it." I just think the phrase, "she looked like a tired child asleep," to describe this this young, promising actress is really, I tugged at my heartstrings.
No, I agree. I didn't mean to make it seem like a rush job going through the clues. What I was trying to do with trying to talk about what can we frame these is that it's structurally odd if you think about the book because of how little the clues, other than the Lord Merton clue, how little they matter to what ultimately happens. And so I don't want to be dismissive of the book at all, because we've heard actually from a lot of people on Facebook and elsewhere that this is actually one of their favorite Christie novels. And I think that part of the reason also why I kind of wanted to hightail it through the clues is it's more interesting to discuss how they exist in the book than it is to discuss them themselves. Because sometimes, you know, we like to parse the clues, but here it's not interesting to me, not at all, in fact. Whereas what is interesting are the surrounding pieces. So the interesting thing is Carlotta Adams. Carlotta Adams actually has a really kind of complicated, interesting life. Her sister, the fact that she's an American, her flat when they go to it, it's clearly not as fancy. It's like in a nice area. It's described pretty specifically, but she's not quite there yet. You know, she's like one step away from being a known actress. She's somebody that people go and see and are delighted by, and like probably she sells out her smaller theater, but she's not a name yet. That 10,000 pounds mattered to her.
I would argue that she is the personification of promise.
Yeah.
And Christie strikes her down. And Christie, I'm sure, hated striking her down because Poirot's sentiment about, I don't like to see youth deprived of its right to live, that is Christie. And we know that from reading her own autobiographical writings and just from the research we've done at this point. Nothing horrifies her more than that. This innocent who had all this promise and so much to contribute.
Then again, she has struck down some other very innocent, youthful characters in other recent books that we have discussed with very few qualms.
Sure, but I think the difference is that it's the promise, because this was someone who actually had a gift. She was special, and she had something to actually give, and she was doing it.
I don't know. I think that there was probably a character in Peril at End House who probably had a promising life ahead of her.
But I would argue that that was also very effective. I mean, we have that scene of the parents' grief in Peril at End House was, for me, a standout scene in those books. I think these are the elements of Christie that often just get steamrolled when people want to just talk about the more cliched ways that these stories work or just talk about the mystery. I mean, those elements are there, and they're interesting, and they're really effective as written.
Again, speaking of Peril at End House, spoiler alert, anybody, here again we have another murderess. And they're certainly, in a lot of ways, somehow more interesting than at least some of the male villains we have thus far come across. We've mentioned it now several times, but I think that throw in witness for the prosecution in here as a villainess. So, you know, if we're talking about a Jane Wilkinson or a Nick, they are so incredibly damaged. There's also something very performative about Nick in some ways, going even to her gendered name. But here in this, we have a really interesting performance that is going on the entire time, right? By Jane Wilkinson, the entire book. So, you know, you mentioned that. You mentioned it earlier, but we're talking about actors. But this entire book is about performance.
Oh, it's entirely about performance. I would like to bring in a new reference point for us, which is this book, Queering Agatha Christie, by the one and only Dr. Jamie Bernthal, who not only...
Who we love
because he organized the Agatha Christie conference we attended recently, along with his cohort, Mia Dormer, and we did have such a lovely time there. But his book is fantastic, and it takes kind of a granular look at a lot of Christie novels through really a lot of different lenses of literary theory.
Right.
And he has some interesting things. You know, we're actually going to have Jamie on the podcast at some point. He promised that he would do it because...
And we will hold him to that promise.
We will, absolutely. In case he's listening right now, and he better be, he will be much more eloquent and articulate as to a lot of what he says in that book than we will be. But he does have a whole section on Lord Edgware Dies, and piggybacking on what you were just saying, Catherine, there was this meta-analysis done of Christie novels in the last year or two where people were saying, well, Christie follows a formula, and almost always, if the murderer is female, then it was done via poison or something less violent, and usually for some sort of a reason. But that's certainly not the case here. That certainly wasn't the case in Peril at End House, and I think it's really interesting that Lady Edgware, it's mentioned several times that she has zero morals. She has no sense of right or wrong and has no qualms with what she does, and it's completely self-interested. And there are 3 murders here, sure, one of them is poison, but the 2 men who she kills, she stabs them. Penetrates them, if you will.
Oh,
yeah.
Wow. Going deep into lit theory here.
Yep, let's do it. I think there's a lot to be said for the way in which Jane Wilkinson, as a character, is constantly pushing against a lot of the, we could call them patriarchal boundaries that are being imposed on her. Again, she's described time and time again as having a husky voice, and just in terms of her sexuality and her appearance, and people all assume that she is ditzy, right?
Right.
That is not the case. The clue with the letter, I mean, that was some ingenuity there with that letter, and I think you could even make the argument that her gaffe when it comes to not knowing that the Judgment of Paris is referring to...
Not the city.
It's referring to the figure from antiquity as opposed to the city. That's a lack of education as opposed to base intelligence. Jane Wilkinson comes across as someone who actually does have a lot of instinct and savvy. She may not be the most educated, but perhaps that's not her fault.
Perhaps not, but she gives very, very little indication that she has any interest in being somebody with any intellect.
Well,
at
what
one
comes
point,
first, the
Poirot
chicken or the
asked,
egg? At that point, I mean, maybe she would have if she was educated.
I mean, I think that's too generous of a reading, because at one point, Poirot asks her repeatedly, to the point where it's in capital letters in the book, "Who do you think killed your husband, madam?" And she just kind of like laughed. I mean, obviously she did.
Yeah, but that's
like,
the thing.
She doesn't.
But you're making my point. She did. That's why she's dismissing that. She seemed ditzy in that moment, but she wasn't.
I suppose so. I mean, I find her...
You fell for her. You fell for her act.
No, I think she is that person.
There's no way you can make the argument that in that moment she was just head in the clouds like, I don't know, she was a murderer. She was trying to evade Poirot as the person who actually committed the murder.
She's incredibly craven and murders another 2 people. I mean,
sure.
I don't think that makes her intelligent. I think that makes her somebody who's really good at doing one thing.
But that doesn't make her not intelligent. It doesn't make her unintelligent. Her ditzy act is an act, and I think it's actually...
I don't think it is.
I think it is.
I don't think it is, because, no, I completely disagree with you. I don't think it is. And I don't think that her interest in upgrading her husband... I mean, her husband is horrible. I will agree with you. But she's just moving on along a path for no reason. It's a little bit like trying to say that...
She is doing it for a reason. That's the only way that she can move on up. How else is she going to? By going to college?
She's in a pretty high position as it is. You're giving her far too much credit. I mean, there's something base about her, and I think that gives her survival skills, which is a skill. Do not get me wrong; it is quite a skill. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean there's anything higher operating. It means that something is functioning forward. And it will do whatever it takes to keep moving forward. But that doesn't mean there's anything else there.
I disagree. What encapsulated it for me...
I think sometimes you give more credit to women than I do.
Maybe, but there was a point that Jamie made, actually, in his book, which encapsulated this for me, which was when he said... Lady Edgware, Jane Wilkinson, rather, she impersonates herself. That's actually how she commits the crime. She goes up to the door, dressed in a black dress and a hat, says, I'm Lady Edgware, so she's playing herself. This is what she does. She's playing at Lady Edgware, and then she commits the murder. The entire thing is an act, and that's where I think it also is quite significant that she's referred to as Jane Wilkinson and not Lady Edgware throughout much of the story, which is quite interesting because she's Lady Edgware throughout, but she's almost never referred to as Lady Edgware, and that's because Lady Edgware kind of doesn't exist. Lady Edgware is a pose.
I mean, if you're going to make the feminist argument, which I, again, would slightly fight back against you on, because I think you're giving her far too much credit. But if we're going to do the feminist reading here, Lady Edgware is a property title. Lady Edgware is somebody else's name that gives her no agency. Jane Wilkinson has agency.
Jane Wilkinson is her name. Absolutely. I don't think that's by accident. I actually think, though, if you were to ask Christie would probably say something along the lines of, she's not Lady Edgware because she's no wife to him because she killed him. That's not, like, she doesn't deserve to be called Lady Edgware. I mean, the person who wanted to be known as a housewife as opposed to a writer, I think might have what would seem to us a non-feminist answer to that. So I don't want to go too crazy with it, but even so, I think that is significant.
I think it's deliberate. I mean,
it's deliberate.
It's deliberate for sure. I mean, yeah, so if you're going to do the feminist reading of it, it's that there are two sides of this coin. There's the Jane Wilkinson that has agency, and there's a Lady Edgware who is essentially property. And so Jane Wilkinson kills not just Lord Edgware, but kills Lady Edgware. So she's destroying this identity, which is this albatross that she's been trying to get rid of for some time.
I don't even think it's something that is necessarily has to be killed. It's a mask that can be put on or discarded.
No, it can't be taken off. That's why she has to have him killed, right? It has to be destroyed also.
I think that she exists outside of it, though, even before Lord Edgware is killed. That's the thing. She's skilled at this. She is skilled at being able to be more than two things.
But she's beholden to it.
Sure, she's beholden to it, but she's able to be more than one thing at the same time.
Somebody likes Jane Wilkinson.
I guess I'm just another one of those silly men who was taken in by her husky voice and alluring face. Anyway, let's move on from that discussion of the text and onto the adaptations. And we mentioned there are 3 film adaptations. The first, we'll just talk about really briefly. Our other good friend, who we had such a good time with at the Agatha Christie conference, Mark Aldridge, whose lovely book we've already mentioned at least once before.
Friend of the pod, Mark Aldridge.
Friend of the pod, yep. His book, Agatha Christie on Screen, which we love. He discusses this film, so it does exist, and he was able to watch it. I could not find it. In 1934, just 1 year after the book was published, which is interesting, this book was adapted into a film starring Austin Trevor as Poirot, and this is actually the 3rd Trevor as Poirot film adaptation. It seems to be most notable for the fact that in the course of the film, Poirot is mistakenly called French, and the mistake is never corrected in the film, which means that maybe the producers of the film actually kind of thought Poirot was French and not Belgian, so that's really bad.
Yeah, not great.
Also, I found this detail really funny. It's so early in the days of talking movies that apparently the actors had to talk really slowly to be understood, which made the dialogue especially ponderous. And it just made me think of that amazing scene in Singin' in the Rain when they're having all the microphone trouble.
She's got to talk into the mic. I can't pick it up.
Cut! What's the matter, Dexter?
It's Lena. Look, Lena, don't you remember I told you? There's a microphone right there, in the bush.
Yeah.
You have to talk into it.
Well, I was talking, wasn't I, Miss Dinsmore?
Yes, my dear, but please remember round tones.
I love that movie.
It's a great movie.
It's a great movie. Anyway, so the first adaptation that we saw is from 1985, and that one is called 13 at Dinner, which is, of course, the U.S. title. This one is with Peter Ustinov. Peter Ustinov played Poirot a couple of times, probably most famously in Death on the Nile. So this is him playing Poirot again, but with a few key differences. 1, the movie was made for television rather than a theatrical release, and I think you can kind of tell. 2, the setting is contemporary rather than period, which is really weird because obviously in Death on the Nile, we're in period, and it's still the exact same man playing Poirot, so it gives the appearance of Poirot having time traveled. I would watch a series involving a time-traveling Poirot, but that's not what they were going for here, so we just kind of have to ignore that. And then Ustinov's portrayal of Poirot is also considerably softened and more like Ustinov himself. Like, he's portrayed in the beginning in this talk show and just kind of like chatting, and that apparently was very much what Peter Ustinov did. He was on a lot of talk shows. It's just like a softer portrayal as opposed to the other films that he did.
Right.
The big get in this adaptation was Faye Dunaway as Jane Wilkinson and Carlotta Adams, which I also had issues with the fact that the same actress was playing the two roles because
they were playing identical twins.
Oh.
It's like the Parent Trap.
Like the moment when they like have the dinner party and the two of them meet, it really is like the Parent Trap.
Let's get together right away. We'll be having twice the fun, and you can always count on me. A Brewster Twosome we will be. Let's get together.
Come on, like you're the same person.
Yeah.
This is Patty Duke with the mirror identical cousins going on here.
But they're cousins, identical cousins all the way.
I don't know. It's
okay.
It's okay. And it's pretty standard adaptation. I don't really feel the need to say that much else about it, except, of course, for one key element, which is who plays Jimmy Japp, Catherine, in this adaptation?
Might it be the one, the only Mr. David Suchet?
David Suchet, Hercule Poirot himself, plays Inspector Japp in this adaptation.
Oh, Japp, what brings you out so early?
Early? I've been up for hours on business. Murder.
Poirot? And who, pray, has been murdered?
Lord Edgware. Stabbed to death last night by his wife.
And he actually talked about it in his book Poirot and Me. He said, I thought Inspector Japp was probably the worst performance I'd ever given in my life. I didn't know what on earth to do with the part, and so, for some unfathomable reason, I decided to play him like a kind of Jewish bookie and make him eat whenever he appeared on the screen. It is really true. When he first comes to Poirot's quarters, he's like scarfing down Poirot's breakfast, and then in the very next scene, he's chowing down really grossly on sausages on the film set where Brian Martin is starring in this cheesy action movie. I thought he was actually fine, other than that. He wasn't...
Yeah, he's not terrible.
He's not terrible. No. And I did also appreciate the sort of Sunset Boulevard ending of Faye Dunaway being dragged away. It's Jane Wilkinson.
Oh my god, it's so cheesy.
And she's just waving to her adoring fans. And it goes on forever, too.
I know.
It goes on for a long time. So that's that one. And then we have the 2000 adaptation where David Suchet is back where he belongs as Monsieur Poirot. This one was actually done right after The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. So it was season/series 7, and I believe that it's just a 2-episode season. So it was just Ackroyd in this.
It was after they came back from having not done them for a long time, right?
Yep.
Some of them are really good, and some of them are just like, it's not that they're rough, but they're hit or miss.
I think they're hit or miss, and I think this one's kind of a miss.
Yeah.
I think it's the worst use of Miss Lemon in anything we've watched for this podcast thus far.
Yeah, and it's getting close to being one of the last ones that she's in, too.
Well, you can see why they phased her out, because with this more serious tone, there just was no...
It doesn't work.
There's no place for her. It doesn't work. Here's where I'm just going to bring up, I mentioned it before, how Carlotta Adams, the character of Carlotta Adams, in both these adaptations, especially, though, the ITV Suchet adaptation, what was that actress doing? I thought it was super weird. First of all, her impersonations were awful. Like, she was terrible at her job. So I immediately was like, I want her dead. And she was just, like, really annoying and muggy. Faye Dunaway also, when she was playing Carlotta Adams, was muggy and weird. It was just the total opposite from what the character was in the book. And in the Suchet adaptation, actually, the woman who played Jane Wilkinson, interestingly, played her very soft and sympathetic until the end, which was an interesting choice. I didn't necessarily mind that. It's obviously a departure from the novel.
I would say it's a major departure from the novel.
It was interesting, though, because I think it actually played into the notion that she is putting on a mask the whole time, and it actually is more ingenious and devious than people such as Catherine Brobeck give her credit for.
Right. Well, I think it's a more interesting character in the adaptation, if you're going to look at it that way. That certainly takes more guile to do what is happening in the episode. You know what I would also say? I think that probably when they were adapting them, they must have had the same kind of feelings that I did reading it, which is like, this is ridiculous.
Or maybe
Like,
they were just inspired by the ingenuity of the character and they just went in another direction with it.
Maybe so. Maybe so.
In terms of actually lifting the story from the novel and putting it on film, there wasn't much changed. And that's probably because of what you were talking about, in that this is not an intricate mystery puzzle that works better on the page than on the screen. This actually is pretty easy to adapt for film because it's characterization and it's linear plot. And there aren't many clues, so it's kind of an easy one to adapt. Maybe that's why there are 3 adaptations of it also, you know? Let's rank this book.
Let us rank this indeed. So plot mechanics. I mean, it's probably going to be pretty high.
Well, going off of your point, which I think is, which I honestly didn't appreciate until we were recording this, I think you're right. I think that it is a mystery puzzle, but I think it's an incredibly simplistic one. I think that it has other elements that make it a good novel overall, but this is why we break down these rankings. If we're talking about plot mechanics, I'm not super impressed, actually. Let's give it a 4.
You might now be ranking it too low because the mechanics of this make sense. There's nothing in this that doesn't make sense from a mechanics perspective.
It does make sense. But I actually think, so plot credibility, because I think plot credibility, again, is like, are humans acting like humans, or is the plot turning on too much coincidence and too much?
Yes, which I think is absurd in this one.
But I don't necessarily think it is, because, you have to get your head around the impersonation aspect. But I think that Carlotta Adams, the way that she's portrayed, I believed that she was as good as she was. And other than that, I mean, the tricks of, it's really just low lighting. I mean, the way that everything plays out makes perfect sense. I would certainly give it higher marks in plot credibility than I would in pure mechanics of plot.
True. I'm not with you on that front.
Okay.
Anything with impersonations and doubles, I'm just going to be inherently suspicious about.
I remember in Murder on the Links, I made a pronouncement that twins are cheap.
Yeah.
Because they were twins.
And this is a twins.
This is a twinning sort of a thing. I think if Christie were here, she would say something along the lines of, well, Ruth Draper would have been able to pull this off. But would Ruth Draper really have been able to pull it off? Fair point. Well, what would you...
Can we come to a compromise?
Sure. I mean, maybe a 5 on plot mechanics.
Well, what are you going to put on plot credibility?
I would give it like a 7.
How about we give both a 6?
Okay, fair enough. That actually feels right to me. So then series-long characters, I more had issues with Hastings and Japp in this novel, only because this is where there's a major departure from the Suchet series.
And that they hate each other?
They hate each other. I mean, Japp is a pain in this novel.
Although Hastings is extra priggish in this.
Constantly making jabs at Japp's vulgarity.
Class.
Yeah.
His class.
Yeah. At one point he says he refers to Japp as winking vulgarly. And Japp himself, though, is more than happy to just pretend that his previously held opinion, he never held it. He just wants an easy solve. He follows Poirot blindly, as opposed to Philip Jackson's rendering of him in the series, which I just enjoy so much more. I mean, it's not at all fair for me to be judging the book based on the adaptation, so I shouldn't. I didn't enjoy that.
It's odd. It's just odd that we hadn't really seen animosity between them as far as I remember prior to this. I actually enjoyed Hastings a little more in this because Hastings is like an extra self-aware dolt in this.
Mm-hmm.
The room we had interviewed her in was on the first floor. As we left it, Poirot took me by the arm. "A little minute. Remain here, if you will, Hastings. I am going down with Japp. Watch till we have gone into the library, then join us there." I have long ago given up asking Poirot questions beginning, "Why?" Like the Light Brigade, mine not to reason why, mine but to do or die, though fortunately has not yet come to dying.
To me, I like all those moments. To me, it felt like more of the same. Like, I feel like we get a lot of those delightful Poirot Hastings moments. I'm a little down on the series-long characters in this one. I would give it a 5.
I don't think that's fair. Want to give it a 6?
A 6 it is! So let's talk about characters specific to this book. Carlotta, I've already mentioned how effective I thought she was. And yeah, we've only really briefly referenced Jenny Driver, but she's another interesting character, and she springs off the page.
Oh, she's great. I really, really enjoy. Like, I was like, why doesn't she come back? Why couldn't there be more Jenny Driver in this?
Right. However, we then have Brian Martin, who is a dud.
Ronnie Marsh.
Ronnie Marsh, who's just obnoxious.
Not a winner.
We'll get to him with Stuck in Its Time. Lord Edgware will get to him with Stuck in Its Time, too, and we hardly even see him. I mean, those two things, to me, wash out a little bit. We have some good characterization, and we have some poor characterization. Jane Wilkinson, I actually think, is very well drawn. I think there's so much going on there that...
Of course you do.
It's masterful. I'm going to say a 7. Carlotta, Jane, Jenny Driver...
Lord Edgware probably is at least memorable.
He's at least memorable. I think that's enough to merit a 7.
All right.
Setting and tone. Catherine, why don't you take this one?
I don't think the tone is particularly interesting.
No.
But I thought the setting was memorable because it is specific about London. And maybe in The Secret Adversary? I'm trying to think of the last time we saw London specifically drawn out.
I actually agree with that. It felt like a contemporary rendering of London in the early 30s. It
because
did.
Places are named repeatedly.
Mm-hmm.
So it's in real places. Mm-hmm. And talking about, getting a car and driving someplace and the timing of how long that took.
Yeah.
Poirot and Hastings and Jenny dine, I believe, in Mayfair. And there's a street name.
There's a lovely little section where Hastings goes on about women's hats because Jenny Driver is a hat designer. Mm-hmm. And I really appreciated that, and that kind of added to the contemporaneity of it.
Yeah.
I still don't think it's a knockout.
Do you want to give it a 6?
Because this is also setting and tone, and the tone to me is rather flat or just kind of all over the place, I might give this one a 5, actually. Would you give it a 7?
Here's the thing. I think that the Stuck in Its Timeness is going to get some big negative points.
Yeah, it is.
And I don't really feel necessarily so bad about this book that I want it ranked that low.
Fair enough. I can deal with a 6.
We can go with a 6.
Right,
okay.
Let's call it 6. All right, so let's talk about Stuck in Its Time because, there's a lot to talk about here. First of all, I would just like to make the point that while we were reading this, sometimes Catherine and I text each other little thoughts and things, and at one point...
I like to take photographs of something that I'm reading and then crop them and send them to Kemper with question mark, question mark.
Or perhaps like a face screaming, which I think might have been in the margins of this.
That definitely might have been this one, yeah.
So Catherine screen capped some rather alarming language that was being used by one Ronnie Marsh, and I was confused because I happened to be reading a Berkeley Books version of this novel, which is not the version I usually read. My edition had been printed in 1984, and they cut out the bad parts, which I didn't know was a thing that happened.
They airplane censored it.
They really did. So anyway, the section that we're talking about involves Ronnie Marsh. It's almost always Ronnie, isn't it?
Yeah.
Ronnie makes a joke about not being able to tell people of an Asian ethnicity apart, and he uses
they're specifically Chinese.
Yes, that's true. They're specifically Chinese, and he uses an offensive word to denote them. He also uses the N-word. The N-word is in here.
In the next sentence, just to be clear.
In the next sentence.
It's almost a hat trick of racism.
Yeah, because then he'll
get there later, but not in 3 sentences.
Eventually. Yeah, about 100 pages later, Ronnie makes fun of the fact that he went to the opera with a family whose name is Dortheimer, and it's very obvious that this family is Jewish. And
it's very obvious because he says it repeatedly.
He says it repeatedly, and he makes reference to their daughter, Rachel, and her long Jewish nose quivering with emotion.
And by the way, he's being invited to the opera with them because they think he's courting their daughter, Rachel.
Yeah. So he's basically making fun of the notion that anyone would think that he is actually courting this rich Jewish woman.
But he likes being invited out with them because he, as we previously said, is really broke, and they bring him to, the opera.
So those are all problematic, but then there's even, I would argue, some implied homophobia in this novel. I think that it's fairly clear.
It's barely implied, just to be clear.
Yeah, well, it's not outright stated that Lord Edgware is gay, but he is referred to as queer. That is a term that can mean a lot of different things, obviously, as Jamie actually talks about in his book. But
his behavior is described as queer.
His behavior is described as queer, and again, back to Alton.
Which is certainly not what she meant.
No, of course not. When she used the word queer, she wasn't saying he's gay, but saying that his behavior was queer couldn't be an allusion to
a lot of different
behavior, including homosexual behavior.
Yeah.
But the big tell here is that, again, going back to Alton, the handsome butler, Hastings, when he's talking about how handsome he is, says, there was something vaguely effeminate that I disliked about the softness of his voice. Later on, Japp's analysis of the handsome butler is, it isn't natural for a man to have good looks like that. And then much later, so Lord Edgware was a man of peculiar tastes. It was possible that facts about him had come to light which, while not entitling his wife to an English divorce, might yet be used by her as a lever, coupled with the threat of publicity. So I think that in the portrayal of Lord Edgware as this depraved and perverse and sadistic kind of character, I feel that his implied homosexuality, to me, I got a homophobic vibe from it. To me, these elements that were stuck in their time felt pervasive. There are a lot of them. They're all over the place. They're of different qualities, and it was hard to get away from.
Yeah.
To me, this feels like, I think 4 is fair.
Yeah, if we gave Peril at Endhouse 4, then that's fine. We can give it 4.
Okay, so our final ranking on Lord Edgware Dies is a 6 + 6 + 6 + 7 + 6 with 4 deductions, which gets us 27, and that actually puts Lord Edgware Dies in a tie with Murder on the Links. And we've discussed this because we're going to come across ties. This isn't the first time it's happened, and it certainly won't be the last.
To be clear, Lord Edgware is a far better book than Murder on the Links.
Exactly. So in the case of ties, we will say which one ranks above. Absolutely, Lord Edgware Dies belongs above Murder on the Links, but
Lord Edgware Dies was felled a bit by our deductions.
As it should have been.
We do appreciate any and all feedback or people who would like to yell at us for them.
Yes, please let us know if you disagree, if you think we're being too hard on Lord Edgware Dies.
I'm assuming that plenty of people are going to think that. And we respect your opinion.
We respect your opinion. We look forward to discussing in whatever forum you would like, which I believe is a wonderful segue to the end of our episode. That is Lord Edgware Dies. Please do contact us. You can do so via email at allaboutthedame@gmail.com or via Twitter at allaboutthedame. You can contact Catherine at Brobcat. You can even contact me at Kemper Donovan on the rare occasions when I check my personal Twitter. You can find us on Instagram at allaboutagatha, and on Facebook, our Facebook page is All About Agatha. Please join us next week when we will be discussing another Miss Marple short story. This one is Ingots of Gold, and that is the third of the Tuesday Night Club murders. We look forward to speaking with you then. Thanks so much. Bye.
See you soon.
Everyone knows therapy is great for solving problems, but getting therapy has its own problems too, like finding the right therapist, fitting into their schedule, and of course, the cost. Well, BetterHelp can solve those problems. It's totally online and built around your schedule. It's surprisingly affordable too. Connect with a credentialed therapist by phone, video, or online chat, all from the comfort of your home. Visit BetterHelp.com to learn more and save 10% on your first month. That's BetterHelp, H-E-L-P.